Okay, hold on, Celine. All right, everyone, our next speaker is Celine Richard, and she was a graduate student at LSU, and I think you graduated in 2019, right? 2020.
2020.
She worked with a lot of different raised bed gardens and looking at how to keep lead out of it. So if you're in urban areas and you have lead contaminated or heavy metal contaminated soils, that was her focus. And she was an excellent student. She now lives in North Carolina and is a county agent there, working with community gardens specifically and with fruit and vegetable crops. It's a wonderful resource.
Okay, we're ready.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Kiki, for the introduction. Yeah, like you said, I work with vegetable and small fruit farmers and home gardeners and community gardens, but specifically anything edible is really what I love to work with and I get to work with. So first things first, we are talking about contaminants in garden soils. I just want to make sure, I'm not here to scare you, just to inform on some of the risk factors that, can be considered, especially, in community garden spaces, and then steps that can be taken to keep yourselves and your gardening communities safe. So based on the fact that this is a community garden conference, I don't believe that I need to I guess, go through all the benefits of community gardens, but, we do have the mental, the physical health that is connected to outdoor time and physical activity, the creative outlets, the, educational opportunities that come along with it, all the way from early childhood to late life experiences. And of course, the social capital, the social experiences, and of course, the fresh produce that comes out of it. And, beautiful flowers, whatever your preference in the garden is. There's always a benefit for everyone. And for these reasons and many others, people love to garden. And we here at Extension, extensions across the country, we love that people love to garden, and we enjoy fostering that in any way that we can. However, it's important to, not sure if it clicked yet. It's important to acknowledge that garden soils, while the, gardening spaces, they foster all these wonderful things. Those spaces can also contain contaminants that can negatively impact gardener health. So we're going to kind of go through a few of those, the potentials that are there, and what can we do about them. So what are soil contaminants? Essentially, they are materials that pollute your garden space. These can be materials that are accumulated over time in the space, dependent on previous land uses. Or they could be contributed by the materials that you bring into your garden, or their pollutants spread to your garden via the outside, factors such like runoff or highway emissions. And some contaminants you might encounter some like heavy metals, some common ones like lead, cadmium, arsenic, some petroleum compounds, other organic pollutants like PAHs, just for an example. And I'm not going to dive too deep into the individual contaminants because there are a lot of them that could be there. Not that they all are there, but just if you want to dive deeper, there's a link here. And I believe this presentation is being recorded. And I can also share this presentation with Joe or Anna if y'all want to access that later. But they have a lot of great fact sheets on individual contaminants and what are kind of the hot hit points of what would you worry about and when. But to dive a little deeper into general contaminants, before we do that, I want to take it actually a step back. And just because I think it's important to step back when we're talking about pollutants and contaminants, especially in the cases of some heavy metals and common pesticides that are used, to bear in mind that a lot of these chemicals naturally exist throughout our environment just already, and it's through human interactions and through human innovation really that they kind of get moved around and used and unfortunately get concentrated to levels that could cause us harm, and ultimately perhaps even in your garden. So some stick around, some are more persistent in the soil, some break down into their constituent compounds, but just kind of step back, this is kind of where they do exist, but through human activity is how they kind of get back into our garden. And so how that is, on this concept of moving compounds from one place to another and ending up in our gardening spaces, how does this happen? Things to consider are previous land use. Like, are you creating a garden where there used to be a house with lead paint? Specifically lead paint, any house or building painted before 1978, so I have to look down at my date so I don't forget. 1978, that's the point at which lead paint stopped being used. That's a potential risk. Industrial spaces, that's, any of those emissions. If you're bringing in materials, consider what materials you're bringing in. So railroad ties, or any older wood, specifically any wood treated before 2004. That's when the arsenate containing compounds stop being used. And in general, improper pesticide use. Are you bringing something in and using it improperly in your garden and contributing to contamination? And then there's ongoing sources. So what kind of sources, what are you surrounded by? Are you near an industrial site? Are you near a roadway? Could those roadway emissions be entering into your garden space? And again, kind of just the visual of that, that's pretty much that. The different types of contaminants we have, it could come in via your irrigation water. Are you pulling something from a pond that has runoff, that has a potential to collect runoff there? Are you near an old building? Is there lead paint chipping, or near roadways? Are you using older treated wood? In some cases, poultry manure, especially if it's commercially sourced, can contain some contaminants. And if you have any questions afterwards of any of these specifics, I may be happy to go into more detail, but just some ideas of some potential pathways. So we understand, that what are the actual pathways? We know they can enter the gardens, but how do they, in other words, how do they get from the soil into our bodies? And some categories of human exposure are, eating, especially directly consuming soil. So think about hand-to-mouth behavior in children, and if we're eating unwashed produce. And some folks have also asked about some level of contamination that could be present in the plant tissue from uptake itself, so that even when you wash your produce, is there any contamination within that product? And it really depends on the contaminant that we're talking about, but many contaminants, as a general rule, and I can't really say a general rule, but in general, root vegetables and leafy greens tend to be higher risk, whereas fruiting vegetables tend to be lower risk. And again, if you have any questions about specific contaminants, I'd be happy to go into further detail. But for many of the contaminants, the largest pathway is through that direct soil contact. So if you're eating unwashed produce with those soil particles on it. And then we have absorption. That's, where generally, that's the concept of the contaminant being absorbed through the skin. And this is the pathway generally of least concern. Very few contaminants are absorbed at largely significant rates through this pathway. And then we have breathing. So are you breathing in those soil dust particles either out while in the garden, or even in the, if you're bringing it inside your house, bringing your dirty shoes in the house and distributing that there. So I'm not here to give medical advice, so I won't really speak into deep depth about the potential health risks of low dose long-term contaminant exposure, because most of these contaminants, if you are having health effects, they won't appear right away. It's going to be over a longer period of time. But the impacts really vary on the type of contaminants present, the amount of exposure, and individual physiology. So for example, the most vulnerable populations for contamination within the garden are going to be young children, pregnant individuals, and their developing fetuses. And again, that's because the physiology part that's going to have a large impact, because a lot of these contaminants impact development at on some level. And some can be carcinogenic, which means they cause cancer. And so if you are concerned about any health effects, that's really a healthcare provider question, but primarily because a lot of the symptoms of different contaminants, especially with heavy metals or any others, the symptoms are symptoms that would appear for other diseases or other issues. So it's hard. It's not something that the Extension Service is qualified to diagnose, and we're not here to frighten you, but just something to consider, and why we care about taking steps to protect you from these contaminants. So that being said, moving forward, I do have good news that there are lots of easy action steps that you can take to mitigate these risks to keep yourselves and the communities that you serve within safer. So forgive me, there's a long name here, the Duke University Superfund Research Center Community Engagement Core, so that's through Duke University, along with NC State Extension Gardner. They developed several resources to help gardeners assess what their risk is and to take steps to mitigate that risk. And so essentially the goal of this resource I'm showing you, and you feel free to scan this code if you're not sure how big the screen is, but you're more than welcome to scan the code and check out it's like a survey of sorts. But essentially the goal of this is to help gardeners understand what contaminants may be present in the gardens they're in, identify possible sources of contaminants both in and around their garden, identify gardening practices that either increase or reduce the exposure to the contaminants in their garden, and then resources for testing their soils for these contaminants if they're curious about identifying which ones they should be worried about, if any. I will say that this resource can be used by any gardener across the country, but do bear in mind that many of the provided resources within it are specific to North Carolina. For example, when asking questions about site history, they offer resources such as the tax office and flood maps and things like that, specific to North Carolina. But I'm not exactly sure what parallel resources are in Louisiana, but I'd be happy to look into that. I didn't quite have time to look into it, but just so you know, but in general, when you're looking at these resources, they go through a series of questions that are very general, that they can be used, in any location, and they give feedback based on your questions. So for example, some series of questions that they ask are on land use and then gardening practices, and what materials are you using. And so what I think is really cool about this resource is that with every question, they follow up with a response, red or green, depending on if it's something you should worry about or something you're doing good. Basically, either an explanation of why there's one of the practices you're using is a best practice, or what are some of those potential contaminants that you should be or may want to look into as something that might be there. And again, this isn't a diagnostic tool. This is just I would say a quasi-diagnostic tool of a potential risk based on your specific garden's either history or current uses. And so basically, if you take this go through this resource and decide you want to test your garden soils, there are lots and lots of resources available for that. Unfortunately, I know a lot of university-based resources don't offer contaminant or especially heavy metal soil test as a basic component of their soil testing. I know at least last I looked at Louisiana, LSU didn't. I know North Carolina doesn't, but there are plenty of private labs that do offer that service. If that's something that you are interested in, there are some resources here. So again, the most important thing is, what steps can you take to mitigate the risks that might be associated with these contaminants. So pH is a really important one. Generally, 6.5 to 7 is a good range, not only for plant health, but it also decreases uptake of a lot of contaminants, especially like heavy metals. And the reason this is because, just like a lot of soil plant available nutrients that are needed for plants are only available at certain pHs. It acts very similarly with a lot of these contaminants, especially heavy metals. They're in basically in forms that aren't mobile, aren't available to be taken up. So you want to, keeping that pH in at 6.5 to 7 range is a good practice to avoid to mitigate that risk. So lower, the more acidic that your soil becomes, the more available some of those contaminants become, especially heavy metals. Covering our soil. Again, not only is covering our soil good for retaining moisture within our soils, it means you're going to be fighting a lot less with weeds, but it also prevents, I already talked about that breathing in, that pathway of breathing in contaminants via loose garden soil. So the more we can keep that soil covered, the less likely we'll be, breathing in that soil and that dust. The same with keeping it moist. Now, preventing as much dust as we can. So, think about your pathways, especially if you're not gardening. You're going to fight less with weeds, but also keeping that dust down. And adding compost. Again, compost is a great way to keep those soil microbial environments happy, but they also again help bind some of the contaminants and make them less harmful to us, and then less available for plants. And again, if you go to the there's a link there to some composting resources. Some other recommendations by extension systems. So, at least for example, for my studies, I ended up in my master's, I ended up looking at raised beds. So is raised beds a feasible option for specifically for avoiding lead exposure in the garden? And for many contaminants that are, if they are soil borne, that is a recommended practice across the country. But I will say again, a really important part of this is we talked about ways that you can bring contaminants in. What materials are you using? Are you using something that's not going to, say, choose food safe garden materials? Are you using something that's going to, bring more contamination into the garden than you're trying to keep out? So just making sure that you're using something that, so for example, if treated woods, don't use those older treated woods. In some cases, some metals can leach. For example, chromium and zinc. Zinc it is a plant nutrient, but at high levels it can cause some issues. Avoid pollution from roadways. So if you are in a heavily trafficked area, we talked about historically, consider that is something that could, you might have some lead in that area from historic lead emissions, but just in modern day, that there's other pollutants in those emissions that can over time potentially cause harm. And so considering hedging or fencing that can help reduce that airflow from that roadway into your garden space can make a difference. And limiting chemical use. And I say limit chemical use. Pesticides and in general are if used properly within a garden system, can be a great, wonderful asset for the garden overall. But we always preach that label is the law. So make sure you're reading those labels and using them correctly in your garden system. And so general good practices, wash and peel your produce carefully, rinse and peel, especially root crops. If you are concerned with, soil contamination, make sure you're removing those soil particles, protecting your skin, wearing your layers, your gloves and boots in the garden, and then leave that dirt at the door. So you say you're wearing your boots, you have those tools in the garden, leave them outside. Don't bring those boots inside and track that soil all throughout your house or your workplace, etc. And wash your hands. This is a general practice, a good practice in any system that you're in. But if you're worried about soil contamination, washing your hands, your face, anywhere that soil would have gotten, make sure you get that off of you before you go track it in somewhere else. So I kind of flew through that, but I knew we're kind of crunched on time, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. I didn't realize how fast I would go through that, but yeah, any questions, concerns, comments?
I'm going to relay the questions to you, if that's okay.
Perfect. I'm not sure. I don't know if I get to see y'all or not. No, I don't. I'll just put this.
No, there's no camera.
That's fine.
And something else. It had STA and OMRI. I know what OMRI is, but what's the STA?
Oh, your slide with composting sources, you had OMRI and one other organization listed as a certifying body. What's the other one?
Let me see.
STA.
STA. Oh, I don't remember. I can find out and let the committee know. I'm sorry, I don't remember what that one was. TA standard.
Okay, so our community garden is right next to railroad tracks, and I was wondering if pollutants were a concern from actual trains going by.
Okay. Pollution, the garden's right next to a railroad track. What kind of
Mhm.
contamination risk is there?
For trains, so I mean, yeah, there's the treated railroad ties, but I mean that's all. But you're worried about the actual train. So those are going to be your. Forgive me, I'm remembering my chemical compounds. Is that going to? There could be off the top of my head. I cannot remember which ones would be because off of I'm not I can't remember what trains would run off of.
Diesel primarily.
Okay, yeah, so diesel, yeah, thank you. Then that would be your diesel range organics. So let me see if I can y'all see my screen still?
Yes.
Yeah, so those are gonna be your diesel range organics. So those are gonna, the ones found in diesel fuel. Those tend to not be taken up by plants, fortunately. So that would be more of a physical, like make sure you're removing the soil particles from your from your produce, and make sure you're not tracking that in. As far as the rates at which you might be exposed, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I'm not sure, how frequently trains actually run by there. But this would be the types of contaminants that you would be looking into.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Other questions? Yes.
What about like animals? I mean, you know how like you have your own animals and then you have animals that are out wild. So what's the difference? I mean, like, especially if your own animals, they have like dogs and cats and
Yeah.
stuff like that. How is that with the garden?
Can you talk about potential animal-related contaminations like
Yeah.
BSAOs and dog feces, stuff like that? I know they cover some of that in the PSA trainings.
Yeah, so with animals, I mean, a lot of the largest concern with animals that I would have would be from a food safety, like from a biological concern. So anytime you're having animals, pooping and peeing in your garden space, there's a risk that they are, there's, you got E. coli and related bacterial diseases that can be transmitted. So with that, the best practice with those is anytime that you do see animals in your area, especially if you see any, for example, if you see feces, the best practice there is to, kind of like I say a 1 to 2 foot radius of, we won't harvest anything in this area because you can't necessarily say whether or not that contains something you should be worried about. You mentioned BSAOs. I'm not familiar with those.
Biological solids of animal origin, so like
Oh, okay.
unfinished manure compost. We see that a
Okay,
lot.
then yeah. That's the same concept of anytime, just the same. It's the same reason that we have to compost manure through, a standard practice. You can't just put that into your garden and call it a day. It has to go through 3 or 4 different temperature stages of heating and cooling before you can guarantee, without beyond a reasonable doubt that there is that those different bacterial concerns have been, killed off. So within that, if you can, I love an animal in the garden, but I do encourage people to, make sure that they do know where the where they're using the bathroom. But the biggest concern with that is them actually, using the restroom and using your garden as a restroom. So if you can, if you are having that issue, building small, depending on what the animal is, some sort of barrier around your gardens that they can't reach over into, or, maybe having a space that, you let them eat that. And if they poop around it, it's fine. And protecting the rest.
Yes. Two questions related to two other questions I have in that. So, I'm from Denver, very urban environment. One of the community gardens has, traffic, pretty heavy, almost 24/7 traffic on the three sides. It's trying to garden three sides. So there's a fence up, but it's a very open fence. Any other, barriers we could put up? And then the second question, what about human waste?
Okay. So it's a two-part question. The garden is bordered on three sides by very heavy automobile traffic, and the fence is somewhat open. What is the best fencing material or strategy there? And then also human feces, which is an ongoing problem in some of my gardens I work with.
And urine.
Oh, and urine too, yes.
Urine, okay. Well, so I'll address the barriers first, and I think I have a follow-up question for the other one. Yeah, anything that can, if you imagine, air particles, like, you imagine like a smoke, right? That's anything that you can do to prevent as much of that from passing through as you can will help. So you said, I imagine you said it's a loose fence, maybe like a chain link fence or something like that, possibly. And I would encourage, if you are trying to, like I said, block that as much as you can, hedge barriers and fast growing, any kind of fast growing hedge if you're looking for some sort of material. I know there are like those mesh, like those mesh sheets that you can attach, like those privacy sheets you can attach to things like chain link fence. I'm sure that something like that could also be attached to, I'm not sure what type of fence you have, but anything that breaks up those particles. And again, you're not going to exclude completely. You are in that you're in urban space. You're in that in that kind of corner of those roads. But I will say that a lot of the, like I said, the diesel range organics and the ones that are, those emissions based contaminants, they do tend to be soil based contaminants. So it's one of those things you need to really wash your produce. It's not necessarily, they aren't as likely to end up in your produce, for what it's worth. And then urine and human waste. Is this a vandalism type of thing, or is it people just not having access to a restroom, or it's just you're kind of finding it and not sure where it's coming from?
It's both.
Yeah.
Okay.
People who are experiencing homelessness, leaving behind no available public restrooms within walking distance. I mean, it's starting with much problem, but that is becoming the easy.
Did you catch all that?
I caught part of it.
Okay, yeah, related to issues of homelessness and bathroom access. So a little bit of everything.
Yeah, so it's really good practice, especially in community garden spaces, to have an accessible bathroom, for your people, but anyone who's visiting, right? So I mean, the best solution I can think of is maybe installing a porta potty. I know that is an additional cost. I know that a lot of times community gardens are, things that you want in this gardens can be cost prohibitive, but that is really one of the first steps that when we work with gardens is making sure there is an accessible bathroom, not only, for using the bathroom. If people are using the restroom on the side of your garden space, where are they washing their hands? And then they're going to touch produce, they're going, mess with the plants, and that's a major health risk. And then also, if you are, you said you do have issues already of people using the restroom in places they shouldn't. I'm not sure what the topography of where you are is, but another thing to consider is where are people doing this and where's the water flowing, because that could also be contaminating, introducing bacterial or viral particles via the water that's flowing in that direction. But so honestly, I really encourage people to have some sort of restroom facilities anywhere they're dealing with growing food within a reasonable walking distance, to discourage that kind of activity and avoid issues that are related to it. Unfortunately, sorry. Is that something that's possible in your space, or is that something kind of one of those something that you maybe don't have the capacity to do, or?
It's part of an ongoing conversation. It's
Mhm.
land owned by, the Parks Department, and in some of the places in, parks as well as community gardens where there are portalets, there are deeper problems with the use of those. So, yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thanks so much.
Okay.
And we did record it, so we're good there.
Okay. Well, sweet. Yeah, like I hear my contact information, well, is here. So